Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Everything is Everything. As always, we're very grateful to you for being here with us, for wasting your life listening to us rambling. Amit, how are you today, and what fun things are we going to do today?
I was in a good mood till just now when you said that they are wasting their lives. They are not wasting their lives. We are going to tell them stories. And that's what we are going to do today. We are going to entertain them with stories. We've done 3 such episodes before. 2 were a mixed bag of different stories that should be films. And the third was a story that should be a web series, The Reformers, which we spoke about at great length. And today we are going to do just that. You have a bunch of stories. I have a bunch of stories. Let's go for it.
Amit, let's get going. Tell us your first story today.
So, if you remember, in our episode on the Reformers, in that particular web series, one of the sort of recurring motifs was a person in a swimming pool, right? Now, my story has no connection whatsoever with that episode, but swimming is a key theme of this episode. I recently did an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with Deepak VS, who's this brilliant entrepreneur based in Bangalore. And Deepak said something very interesting. I mean, I find him an incredibly fine thinker. He's in his mid 20s. And he said something very interesting. He said, Amit, imagine a thought experiment that for IIT entrance test, instead of doing what you do right now, you have swimming tests, right? So whoever can swim the most in a particular period of time, or whoever can, do the fastest, whatever, you get through to IIT. It's all about swimming. And India has plenty of coastline. It won't be a problem to practice for it. And his contention was that the engineers that we will get will be as good as the engineers that we get now. Now, I got carried away by this wonderful idea. And I said, no, they will be better. They will be better because what you are selecting for now is hunger, passion, initiative, all of these things. Like I said, I got enthusiastic. And, they will be better. And then, like a wise man, even though he is a young man, he corrected me and he said that no, because you see, what will happen in the second year is that the system will get gamed again. So Kota will start having swimming classes. They will have billboards on which they will have swimming coaches in speedos, and everything kind of, goes to hell in that way. We have a wonderful arrival of a great cat, young cat. We are talking about IIT. You do not want to be here, but we are also talking about swimming and the open ocean. So my story, and this is obviously fiction, begins with a, begins with a situation in which this has happened. Some crazy government has actually passed this law, and you now get into IIT by swimming. And we are in the second or third year where the gamification has happened. And our hero is a young man who has just finished the 10th standard, and he's being, trained so that after the 12th he can get into IIT, and he has to go and swim. Now, the tragedy of this particular situation is that our enthusiastic young man, like this fellow here, actually wants to do engineering. His heroes are engineers. He has that kind of mind. That is what he wants to do. But the poor fellow has to now learn swimming, right? So he's enrolled in swimming classes, and you have now, like you have Olympic size swimming pools, you have IIT size swimming pools, and he has to go there and practice. So you have sort of the treadmill of swimming pools happening to him, where he's going to swimming pools and he's swimming, and he's like, what the fuck, I really love this thing. And you can show the disillusionment where in the changing room, the other boys, they can swim faster than him. They don't give a shit about engineering. He's like, what is this? These people don't care. They don't know nothing. I have the passion. I want to do this. But he's got to learn how to swim, right? And at one point, he sees this extreme competitiveness. It irritates him. He even begins falling for someone at some point. I haven't yet decided boy or girl, but he begins falling for someone. But then that person's competitive streak, when that person reaches out of the lane and hits him to get ahead, hurts him and disillusions him. So one day he goes to the nearby seaside and he says, to hell with the swimming pool. Why should I stay in my lane? As it is, literally. Let me swim a bit in the sea. So he swims in the sea. And now, for the first time, he kind of likes swimming. The sense of freedom, just the smell of the open sea, the air and everything. And there is a particular point beyond which you cannot swim, because it's too dangerous, and there's like a little out hanging of a cliff or whatever marking that point, so everybody knows you don't swim beyond that, it's dangerous. So he goes up till there and comes back, and he really likes it. And some days he's just basking in the water. He hears the sounds of the real world around him, fishermen, fisherwomen, he'll see flora and fauna and see all kinds of creatures he's never seen before. He'll get curious about them. He'll start diving deep. But His grades in the coaching class are going down. His attendance is bad. When he goes out there, he doesn't get the point, this point to that point as fast as you can. It's like rote learning, right? And he just likes swimming in the open sea. So that is the situation in which we are. And he fails his exams and he doesn't get into IIT. And he goes back home and his mother refuses to talk to him. They're just shattered because this is the only son, this was a big dream and all that. So, he walks a bit, you see him walking barefoot in the sand in the seaside where he goes, and he walks out into the sea and starts swimming. And he reaches that point where he's not supposed to go beyond. And then he goes beyond that point. And then you just have a few moments of silence, maybe a couple of minutes where there is a storm brewing and he gets further and further away till you can't see him anymore.
It's heartbreaking. It's very sad. It is a great metaphor for our times. Yeah, rather than some silly TV serials about children preparing in quota, this is deep and allegorical.
And I think there's so many metaphors in the swimming against the tide and finding the joy of not having to get expertise or knowledge in a particular lane, but actually being in the open sea, exploring as you want. It's beautiful to me.
A little more of a redemptive story would be nice.
Redemption, you want a happy story, we all die, So I'm going to end this particular chapter in the story by reading out one of my favorite poems. This is by the great poet Stevie Smith. It's called Not Waving But Drowning. Nobody heard him, the dead man, but still he lay moaning. I was much further out than you thought, and not waving but drowning. Poor chap, he always loved larking, and now he's dead. It must have been too cold for him, his heart gave way, they said. Oh, no, 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 it was too cold always, still the dead one lay moaning. I was much too far out all my life, and not waving but drowning. So, Ajay, you wanted redemption. I demand redemption now. I give you a sad story. What is your story?
I have a similarly oddball story which has a disappointing and troubling end. Every word of it is true. Okay, so we are going to take you back to the age when the Chinese had begun a nuclear weapons program. They obtained nuclear weapons knowledge from the Soviets, and they were on their way to building a nuclear weapon. And that was an important problem for the world to understand. Where are they? What kind of nuclear weapons are they building? How far along have they come? They would naturally be doing the nuclear weapons testing in the plateau of Tibet. And in that age, we're discussing the 50s, in that age, there was not the adequate level of spy satellite coverage. So you couldn't really peer down from the skies and monitor the plateau of Tibet and keep track of explosions. Okay, so this was a problem that needed to be solved. And one fine day, the CIA approached the Indian authorities with a proposition. Okay, so the CIA found out that an Indian army team had recently climbed Kanchenjunga. Okay, so you will recall in our hiking episode, I talked about the Gochala trek, which gets you to look up at Kanchenjunga from the Indian Sikkim side. Okay, and equally, you could climb up from the Nepal side. An Indian army team had successfully climbed Kanchenjunga from the Indian side, I think. And the Americans had this idea that, you know what, let's haul a pile of equipment up to the top of Kanchenjunga, which is some 28,000 feet high, and peer down on the Tibetan plateau, which is 14,000 feet. And standing there, you are a fixed observation post. And for years and years, you will be watching for explosions and gathering dust from the air and measuring radioactive materials and such like, and radioing all this information back. That was like a great idea. Okay, so they put together a first meeting. The Indian side agreed. Okay, so the Indian government at that time had sufficiently good relations with America that the Indian government agreed, saying, yeah, this is a good idea. And the idea was the Indian Army and the Indian mountaineers will be part of this project to put the equipment up. The American mountaineers will also be there, and both sides will get all the data. So the Indian side was sort of offering access and support in climbing Mount Everest. The American side was offering equipment and also climbers, and put together, both sides would get the information, which is a win-win for both sides. So the first meetings took place. And the Indian mountaineers who had just come back freshly from climbing Kanchenjunga were told something like the plutonium battery is 70 kilograms heavy. And they just said, "Are you nuts?" Like they just flat refused. They said, "We are as good as the best mountaineers in the world, and there is no way you can take a 70 kilogram battery up Kanchenjunga." Okay, that is nonsense. It cannot be done. Just forget about it. Okay, now you will say plutonium battery. So what was going on was that you needed a power source which would sit at the top of Kanchenjunga and work for years and years. Think, what is the technology which will sit unassisted at the top of Kanchenjunga and handle storms? So like no solar panels. In any case, at that time, solar panels were not there. And will just keep on making energy without a fuss. And the answer is plutonium decay. So you use plutonium decay and you get electricity out of that. That was the battery. So there was a plutonium powered battery that had to be hauled up to the top of Kanchenjunga. So the Americans tried to press the Indian side, say, "Come on, we'll fight, we'll struggle, we'll do it. We're all great mountaineers." These guys said, "You don't know anything. We climbed Kanchenjunga last month and it can't be done. Like there is no way anybody can take this equipment up to the top of Kanchenjunga. But we have an alternative idea." So the Indian side said, "Let's do Nanda Devi instead." Okay, and then people sat with the whole thing, not as perfect as Kanchenjunga, but like plenty high and beautifully located above the plateau of Tibet. And so that plan was hatched, that a joint Indian-American team would climb up to the top of Nanda Devi and mount this equipment at the top of Nanda Devi, which would look down into Tibet. There is a beautiful Wired magazine article on this. We'll link to this, which tells the American end of the story. Thank you, Shahji Vikraman. He was the person who first told me the story and gave me a book on which tells this story. So the American side of the story, which is in Wired magazine, tells a story of a mysterious process by which the most elite climbers of America, one by one, were the subject of an outreach by the CIA that, "Would you like to come climb a mountain in the Himalayas? You have to swear to complete silence. We'll pay all expenses." We're like, "Huh?" It's like, wow, I get to climb one of the world's top 5 peaks and all expenses paid, but I've got to be sworn to secrecy. So one by one, the team was assembled. Okay, and then finally, the day came to go. So the joint Indian-American team tried to go up once. I believe it failed. They came back. Then they tried to go up a second time, and there was a crazy storm. And they felt that this was a clear opening. It was a clearing in the mountains. And they said, "This stupid heavy equipment, we don't want to go all the way down and then lug it back up here." So they lashed it to the stones at a clear visible sign, and they memorized to themselves, this is where the equipment is. Bracket, in that age there was no GPS, so they could not take the coordinates of the place, but like they clearly memorized the scene, and that's where we have lashed the equipment. And there was a crazy storm coming up, so they quickly tied the equipment and ran back down. A few days later, the storm subsided. They said, "Okay, fine, let's go back up." They went back up, and the place was unrecognizable and the equipment was all gone.
That's a whole story.
Well, it goes further. So, like, what the hell happened? They searched and searched. Has it fallen down some crevasse? Okay, just there was no sign of the equipment. Nobody was able to find that equipment. Now, the amount of plutonium in that battery, if it found its way down the melting glacier, ultimately into the Ganga, then tens of millions of people in the Gangetic plain would die.
Wow.
So this is not a small matter, losing that thing. There are other theories. So for example, there is a theory that the Chinese knew all along that this project was afoot. They understood that there was a storm. So when the Indians and the Americans came back down, the Chinese quickly climbed up from their side, grabbed all the equipment and ran away. Who knows? I mean, one day after the fall of communism, when their archives open, we'll get the true story from their side. But as of today, nobody knows about it. Okay, so the equipment was lost. But there was this threat that what if somehow it tumbles out? What if there is a landslide or there is a grinding of the glacier which breaks open the plutonium battery, and then that chemical plutonium spills out and then gets washed out with the melting ice or the glacial flow, and it comes down. And we don't know what the hell to do when once that happens, but don't you want to kind of watch whether it is happening? Okay, and all this was top secret. So what do you say to people like, oops, we lost some plutonium near the top of Kanchenjunga, near the top of Nanda Devi, and by the way, it can kill tens of millions of people in UP. What do you do in all this? So the Indian government chose a cover story, right? So you always need a plausible cover story. They said that there are too many hikers, too many hippies going up Nanda Devi. Nanda Devi is truly precious. It is an biodiversity reserve of the highest importance, and it needs to be protected. There are too many hikers, too many hippies smoking dope, pitching tent in the region of Nanda Devi, bracket, it is one of the world's most glorious hiking regions. Gentle reader, if you have never hiked in your life, you must run, not walk, and get up to the Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve, as it was called. So they just shut it down. They shut off all access. They said, we are doing very high level of ecological protection, so no human beings allowed. So that was part one. Just you don't want anything to happen where some hiker stumbles on some plutonium or gets radioactive poisoning from some plutonium. Okay, so that was part one. And then for years and years and years, they searched the mountain with Geiger counters. They installed fixed Geiger counters. To the best of our knowledge, there is a very slight increase in the radioactivity. And for the rest, there has been no sign of that payload. Okay, so one theory runs like this. Plutonium is warm. Plutonium is always warm because it's always going through radioactive decay. Yeah, I'll tell a side story which will give you the humor of plutonium. The Soviets were building their atom bomb project. Okay, and the NKVD, led by Beria, was a whole bunch of suspicious jailers who were managing the physicists, who did not trust the physicists, who believed the physicists would just fool around and do their science and actually make no bomb. And by the way, if the first nuclear bomb test had not succeeded, the guards were under instructions to shoot all the physicists.
Oh my God.
Okay, look, this is the Soviet Union. I mean, you should know how these things work out. So one day, a guard smashed a door open and told a physicist, "What are you doing?" The physicist was holding a piece of plutonium in his hand. He said, "I'm doing plutonium chemistry. I'm doing plutonium experiments." He said, "Prove to me this is plutonium. This is just stainless steel. You're lying to us. You're actually a malingerer." You got to be a communist to know the phrase malingerer. It's used in Russian to basically kill people. You're a malingerer. You're just holding a piece of stainless steel. Prove to me that this is plutonium. So physicist thought, how do I prove to this illiterate that this is plutonium? Then he remembered, plutonium is continuously decaying. So plutonium is always warm. So he said, I'll prove it to you. You will hold this piece of metal in your hand and you will stand out in minus 20 degrees and you will feel the metal is continuously warm in your hand no matter how long you stand. And the guard said, okay, very well, I'll do that. So the scientist gave him the plutonium. The guard went outside, stood in the freezing cold for half an hour. Everything else in his body froze. His earlobes got frostbite, but the plutonium stayed warm. And then he came back and said, okay, fine, then I'll kill you tomorrow. So that's a unique property of plutonium. So one theory that the scientists have is that that battery was warm, the plutonium was warm. So the permafrost of the glacier got melted and the battery started sinking into that glacier. And then it just kept going for hundreds of meters. And then it went somewhere deep down in the ice and it's got lodged in some rock and it's sitting there. That's a theory. Who knows? Plutonium will keep going for thousands of years. Okay, so there'll be a great earthquake where at first you will read that Delhi and Gurgaon and Noida have been destroyed, and a few weeks later the Geiger counters will start singing and there will be a great catastrophe in the Ganga.
This is your redemptive story.
This is like, see, the difference between reality and fiction is that reality is not obliged to be reasonable. Every word of this is true. If I came to you, the great
Be careful what you say next.
the
The
great
great
C,
melangerer.
the great CEO of Amit Bhai Media Limited, and I said, I'm going to pitch you a movie story, and you say, okay, fine, just an elevator pitch. All I give you is 2 minutes, and I babble these words: America, India, cooperation, CIA, intelligence, China, nuclear proliferation, plutonium, millions, tens of millions of people in UP could die, hippies at Nanda Devi. You would say this is word soup. Okay, the reality strung these words together and made a beautiful tapestry of a story. Isn't it wonderful?
It's absolutely wonderful. I also have a merchandising idea for you that we could have, because we'll be co-producers, right?
Yeah.
So we could have a T-shirt which says what? Which says, okay, fine, I'll kill you tomorrow. It's the best sort of T-shirt line ever, and it is rich in possibility because you have all the human drama of all the people involved, the climbers, the government, the decision making, etc., etc., and just that image of that last theory, a bit of plutonium sinking through an ice-covered mountain till it rests somewhere in the middle for you don't know how long.
Correct. And the damn thing has a half-life of thousands of years. So like this ain't done. Okay. So gentle reader, you should tell your great grandchildren, don't live in the Gangetic Plain.
Gentle reader, don't have great grandchildren.
Okay, Amit, now your turn to tell us a great story.
Since you have been taking pot shots at fiction, saying this really happened, I'm going to give you a non-fiction story, which also really happened. And this is inspired by what I learned from reading one of the finest books of history I've read in recent years, A Broken Script by Swapna Little. Really the best book of, quasi-Mughal history that I have really come across. Now, what Swapna does in her book is she covers the years 1803, I think, to 1857, about a 50-year period of Delhi, where fascinating things were happening. So I'm just giving you the backdrop here, and then I'll kind of come to the story. But I see this as a web series because there are so many things happening. Now, what's happened is in 1803, the East India Company wins the Second Anglo-Maratha War, and the Marathas, which were actually a dominant force over large parts of North India, are defeated, and now Delhi is kind of nominally ruled by the Mughals, but really it's the East India Company which is incredibly powerful, and this relationships keeps shifting more and more towards the East India Company over the next 50 years. So there is a certain political backdrop which is also a human backdrop, which shows the relations between the Mughal emperors and their British overlords. It shows a relationship within the Mughal Empire where every prince is conspiring to screw the others over so he gets to be the king, including Bahadur Shah Zafar, who's been unfairly portrayed in most popular culture depictions as a weak, ineffectual man who loved poetry, but actually he was a schemer and a plotter and contained multitudes and so on and so forth. So that's a political backdrop. There is also a backdrop of language. This is an incredible period because something happens here which happens rarely in human history, and which is, when I first realized what it was, it's just hard to fathom because it is so far beyond the normal. And that is that the lingua franca of the day changes. At the start of this story, the link language of the Indian subcontinent is Persian. All official documents everywhere are in Persian. That is how the government communicates. What English is in India today, that is Persian. It's just like English is today. It's a language of the elites, and it's a language of power. It may be nobody's mother tongue, but everybody has to know it. Persian is a really big deal. And by the end of the story, over the span of 50 years, Persian is out. It is simply out. Traces, vestiges remain in other languages like the beautiful language you can call Hindustani, which later diverged into Urdu and Hindi. But it's completely out. And the tragedy there is, and everybody's obviously, English is a new lingua franca now. It's getting there. It's a linked language. And the tragedy is that if you are a kid who's 10 years old, you look at your parents and they're completely helpless in the new world because they learned everything in a world where Persian was the language, and suddenly Persian is nowhere and it's changed. And it's like the ground beneath their feet has gone. And this is fascinating. And language also evolves in different ways here, in the sense that printing presses become really popular here. And when you write down a word, you ossify it. When you write down a particular way of using it, you ossify it in that word. Some of the flux that is going on in that beautiful process of spontaneous order, it begins to take a shape. This is both great. It also has its own problems because you lose a lot, which we can discuss later. My center of the story, and perhaps the name of the web series, is Delhi College. right? And I find this story very fascinating because at one point, the East India Company decides, of course, that, they're going to proselytize their civilization. So they're going to have colleges where they will teach all the knowledge that the Western world has gained, because they disregard our local knowledge as useless. But when they form the Delhi College, the endowment for that comes from a gentleman called Fazal Ali, and Fazal Ali has one condition, and his condition is you got to do the teaching in local languages. So all his money goes to the Oriental department, which is teaching the in the local languages, and to nowhere else. So that becomes the dominant theme. And an interesting thing happens here. The interesting thing is that what is being taught in those languages, the local languages, Urdu and so on, is not what has traditionally been taught in Urdu, because the local language systems, the British disregarded completely. So what is being taught is a Western knowledge that the Britishers have brought with
So it's
them.
like we're teaching the Magna Carta, but we're doing it in Urdu,
We are doing it in Urdu.
in
And
Hindustani.
exactly. So it is a complete mismatch because Hindustani doesn't have the language or the ways of thinking to be able to, communicate all of these things. There are no technical terms, nothing, a lot of which is a problem to this day. And so it's a mismatch between a way of learning and knowledge and looking at the world and a particular sort of the need that this is a language you need to teach it in, and the language is not used to this either. So it's kind of this weird mismatch. What also happens here, interestingly, is that you have a bunch of interesting characters, right? There's a great character called Ramchandar. Have you heard of him?
No.
You've never heard of Ramchandar? I hadn't till I did this episode and read the book, and it blew my mind. Ramchandar is a mathematician born in 1821 who tries to explain the rules of calculus using algebra. He writes a book called A Treatise on the Minima and Maxima of Algebra, something like that, and he tries to combine it. This finds its way to the hands of a British mathematician called Augustus de Morgan. And Augustus de Morgan tries his best to promote Ramchandar because he is blown away. He is like sui generis. This genius has emerged out of nowhere. And in 1998, I remember reading a reference from somewhere else that somebody referred to Ramchandar and De Morgan as the Hardy and Ramanujan of their age. And they said that Hardy succeeded, but De Morgan couldn't succeed. Now, Ramchandar is a brilliant man, but he's not only a mathematician. He, first of all, he gains great felicity in English, which is this new language. Though obviously he knows traditional languages as well because he is teaching in Delhi College. So he gets all of that. Two, he is a rationalist, right? So he speaks out against traditional medicine systems. He has no fear about speaking out against religion. He speaks out against every religion that there is, including the local religions and the local traditions and the Western ones. And he is a fearless man of that sort. He starts journal after journal. He starts magazines. He wants to be a public intellectual. He wants to get his ideas out there. He clearly, states that, these ideas have to be spread to the people. And it's, you see that kind of mad fervor in him. So an altogether remarkable man, but a man who's also going through strange pressures that even today we can't really understand. Like one thing that struck me about his story is that when he was around 30 years old, he just crossed 30 in 1852, he converted to Christianity. Now you read everything he's written before this, it makes no sense. He's a rationalist. He's, he mocks all the religions. Why has he done this? Is this some kind of political move, a political play going on? And we don't really know, and there are undertones of tragedy to this story also, partly also because of 1857 changes everything, but I'll get there. So Ramchandra strikes me as fascinating. And these maneuverings which people are doing in the system are great. I mentioned how the Mughal princes are doing it. Ghalib is doing it. You look at Ghalib on the one hand, he's a man of culture. He's kind of immersed in the scene. He's already sort of a legend. But on the other hand, he is borrowing money, running from a money lender, trying to suck up to the British masters, doing all kinds of things which seem so odd. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was the emissary of one of the Mughal emperors. I forget whether it's Zafar or his predecessor, but he was that emperor's emissary to the British court. And I think it was Zafar only. And you can actually see him pleading to the emperor in this obsequious manner that your grace is so exalted, I cannot compare myself, and so on and so forth, which for a great fearless reformer, you're like, what's happening here? But you realize that there are different currents that we swim in at the same time. Some are the currents of history, some are the currents of society, and there's all this other personal stuff happening. So there are deep personal stories everywhere. There's also a vibrant scene, like I mentioned the printing press earlier. There's a vibrant scene of art and culture. There are magazines flourishing everywhere. There is something called the Delhi Urdu Akhbar which opens. Now, if you look at the history of the early newspapers and magazines of the 19th century in England, it is gossip, it is tabloid material, it is crap, you know. And what is Delhi Urdu Akhbar publishing? Swapna writes in a book that just one fairly typical issue of the Delhi Urdu Akhbar carried news from Afghanistan, Herat, Peshawar, Ludhiana, Jodhpur, Hooghly, France, Gwalior, Lucknow, Berar, Bharatpur, Russia, Agra, and Nagpur. Right? So this mind-blowing length. In 1841, the Delhi Urdu Akhbar carries a long essay and an editorial arguing for widow remarriage. This is 1841, right? So there's this ferment happening. There are these dialogues happening. And let me tell you one more thing, that what do you think is a star attraction in a newspaper? Every newspaper of the day has to have it or it won't sell. Make a guess.
Gossip, celebrities, scandal.
No, no, no. It's poetry.
Wow.
That newspapers sell more if they print poetry. So it becomes a fashion that poets, like today we think of the poets as, no one cares about them, they're ignored, and, there's a romantic image of the starving poet in an attic. Poets, in a sense, were the great public figures of their time, that, their poems would come in the newspapers, and it was a selling point. Can you imagine? So that makes me think about what the public is like. And there's a vibrant scene of poetry happening where there are musharas everywhere. And another practice that comes up from these musharas is that in these musharas, people will note down everything being written, and then they'll publish it in a newsletter which is called a taskira. So you have all different kinds of taskiras coming up everywhere, and they sell so well that one gentleman named Karimuddin decides that I don't really care about poetry and musharas, but these taskiras sell so much. So out of commercial interest, he starts holding musharas which become regular so that he can print the taskira. And again, that is a fillip for the poetry scene. Is mind-blowing. And I also think about education in this period, that what happens in the early part of that century is that how do people get educated? If you're an elite, you will go to a guru. That guru will teach you something. You will learn in that way. If you want to learn poetry, you'll find an ustad. You'll become his pupil, and you will learn from him, and it's one-on-one, and it's unsystematic. Two ways to beat this. Syed Ahmad Khan, the legendary Syed Ahmad Khan who founded the Aligarh Muslim University. Syed Ahmad Khan, studies from private tutors till he's 20 and all of that. And then he's done, he's out in the world, he's making a living, he makes a name for himself. And at the age of 30, which in those days is kind of middle-aged, given life expectancy, at the age of 30, he decides, I don't know enough. Right? An accomplished man having the humility to say this, I don't know enough. So he hires 6 private tutors for 6 subjects, and they come and they teach him stuff, and he's educating himself in this way. Right? And how does systematic knowledge get through? There's another gentleman who starts one of these taskiras, which publishes poetry all the way through. But before the poetry begins, there is an introductory essay which is talking about theoretical aspects of the poetry, educating its readers on that this is what meter is like, this is how you use a metaphor. And, this is really common, and this flourishing is happening. So it is just a mind-blowing period. There are great human stories. There is this melting pot of language and culture, and there's a lot happening with food. There's a lot happening with the way people dress. There's a lot of politics. There are battles of egos and all kinds of vanities playing themselves out. And in 1857, this period ends with the mutiny. The mutiny is crushed brutally, and the sense, and the British Empire then, eventually takes over. And their sense is that this was led by Muslims. And therefore, they create this Muslim-Hindu divide. Now, in a sense, the divide and rule policy, you can talk about it having arrived later, but in a sense, this creates a schism where they decide we have to treat them differently and we have to turn them against each other, and so on and so forth. So it's a really fascinating story of a city where there is so much turmoil, where things are changing so fast, where nothing is as it seems. We think, we've spoken before about how the world is changing like it never has. The pace of change is incredible. But man, I still speak the same language I spoke when I was a kid. Right? I still consume the same kind of art. My government is still the same, the maps still look the same. It's not a big deal. But in that period, it is a period of such change, such strife, such creative energy. You've often spoken about how out of dark times comes great art. You have that creative energy, not just Ghalib, but many others writing great poetry, creating great art, this stuff happening in music also. So I think this should really be a web series. But the environment of the Delhi College just strikes to me as, a good focal point of all of this. And by the way, the college also dissipates after 1857 and kind of disappears into nothingness. And, Ramchandra becomes a headmaster of some random school. So that's kind of how it goes. But it seems to me to be a great locus of all this, because you have the collision of the worlds there. You have a beautiful language with its own cultural history, and you have a body of knowledge which now has to be converted into this knowledge. You have rationalists like Ramchandra and many others, some of them are mentioned in Swapna's excellent book, who are looking at the world in a different way, and they're putting the word out there, and they're reaching a receptive audience. You have the use of journals and newspapers because people want to be public intellectuals of the day. Yes, there's no television, there's no social media, but it is a melting pot. The word is getting out there, and I just find this whole thing incredibly fascinating. So, Ajay, what's your next story?
I want to take you back to the early 20th century. This is this rivalry between the British and the Germans on the Navy. The Royal Navy ruled the waves all over the world, and they had a significant head start on the sheer mass of the ships and the capabilities that they had. And Germany wanted to challenge that. So they started a great naval build out. But in 1914, when the First World War started, they were not ready. Okay, so it was too early. They needed to have waited. You see a similar story with Hitler in 1939 also. There were many pieces of his build out which were actually not ready, and he moved too early. Similarly, in 1914, when the First World War started, the German Navy was not ready. So, barring one or two small exceptions, by and large, the shiny, freshly minted ships of the German Navy, which was about probably half the size of the British Navy, just sat out the entire war in the docks. Okay, so beautiful, shiny ships which never went out and did anything. So, there is this beautiful saying that a ship is safe in the harbor, but that's not what ships are for. You want to say like a naval ship is safe in its harbor, but that's not what navies are for.
Otis Redding had a song about it, sitting on the dock of the bay, but continue.
So this poor Navy was there at the end at 1918, and there was a negotiation in the Treaty of Versailles. And in the Treaty of Versailles, there were many, many painful conditions that were imposed on the Germans. One of them was, you'll hand over your fleet to us. Okay, so what the Allies wanted was that there shall not be an offensive capability in Germany. So the German army was capped at 100,000 people, no tanks, no navy. Okay, these were the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany had no choice, they had to sign. So the entire shiny, freshly minted German Navy had to be gifted over to the British. And this delivery of a Navy, just pause to think of this delivery of a Navy. I mean, you've got a Amazon delivery happening. Think of a delivery of a Navy. This
कौन
delivery
लेके
of
जाएगा?
this delivery of a Navy, like more than 100 ships, more than 100 submarines, and so on, was supposed to happen at a place called Scapa Flow, which is at the top of Scotland. Okay, look in the map, you'll see that it is the farthest away from the continent. So the idea is the British wanted the most amazing place where they could put up a naval base, which is far away from any continental attacks. So they chose Scapa Flow. So the delivery of the Navy was supposed to happen at Scapa Flow. And so the big day came, and the entire German Navy limped into the harbor at Scapa Flow. And there were also some petty, stupid things that happened. Basic things like, not enough food and sanitation for the German sailors in the days that led to the handover. So there was just like petty bad things that happened. The German sailors had other plans. So what was supposed to happen was they were supposed to hand over the ship, jump off the ship, and the British would transport them back, and they would sail across the channel and go back home. Okay, this was supposed to be the deal. The German soldiers had other plans. They said, hell with you, we're going to scuttle this navy. Okay, so they mounted explosives at the right places. They mounted powerful explosives at the right places in their ships. And at the right day, one by one, the explosions came, and something like 70, 80 big warships blew up and sank into the water at Scapa Flow. Okay, so that is the amazing thing that happened. That the sailors had their own view of what should be done, and they said, "No, hell with you. You may have signed the Treaty of Versailles. We refuse. We're not giving you the ships."
I have a question for you. At a normative level, as a soldier, you should follow orders.
Yes.
That is a deal.
Yes.
We can say that I must follow my conscience, or etc., etc. But the point is, if everyone starts rationalizing like that,
Correct.
you kind of get screwed.
Correct.
On the other hand, if England had lost, but right now we are on the side of the Allies. We are on the we are on England's side in this case.
Yeah.
But if England had lost and had to give its navy, and let's say it happens in World War II when the Nazis are taking over, we would have said no. If a soldier
Heroes.
blows it up, it is
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So I just wonder about this sort of tussle that is there
Correct.
between what you know is normatively correct,
Yeah.
but what you feel really strongly that I want to blow it up.
Yeah. So that's why it's lovely movie material. You go into the minds of the characters. I'm sure there would have been huge debate to and fro. Some would be saying, look, deal's a deal. We signed the Treaty of Versailles. Now you shut up and obey. Others would say, why the hell will we give a freshly minted navy that has never fought a war? And we just like handing over our entire strength to the British. And the British are the greatest navy of the world. So like Mr. Hitler had to start all over again, starting to build a navy. Okay, so there were these conflicting emotions there. I want to remind gentle reader, we talked about Mars El Kebir in Algeria, where there were French ships in a similar situation, where like morally the right thing to do was for the French to come over and join the British side. But that would have meant disobeying orders. And the French side decided we're going to obey orders. We're now on the German side. And the British opened fire and destroyed the French navy, and thousands of people died right there. Okay, so there's that kind of debate. So there's this very interesting moment and a dramatic moment which modern CGI can do justice to, where some 50, 60, 70 big naval ships, one by one on a clock, every 1 minute an explosion takes place and one more ship goes down. And lots of people died in those things because the evacuations had not been quite planned that way. So off the coast of Scapa Flow, there is all this stuff lying in the ground. That, it turns out, is pretty interesting and pretty useful. The reason is that ever since the first nuclear testing of 1944, there has been radioactive dust in the atmosphere. Okay, so many nuclear bombs have been exploded and they have thrown nuclear dust in the atmosphere. That nuclear dust is everywhere. It has contaminated your shirt and mine. Okay, it is there in this dust. It is there in the ground below us. It is everywhere. Now remember, I told you that at Nanda Devi, you need a delicious piece of equipment that is called a Geiger counter. So see, stories and stories are all coming together. Mars El Kabir and Nanda Devi, and now
Everything is everything.
Scapa Flow, all the story, the tapestry of the world brings everything together. You need Geiger counters. Now Geiger counters require steel. The steel should have a special property. It should not be radioactive from the get-go. If the steel is already radioactive, it does not have the correct discriminating power. All the iron and steel made in the world today is messed up because there has been too much radioactive dust from the air. So all the iron ore and all the coal and all the steel mills of the world are contaminated. What you want is beautiful virgin steel that was made before the age of nuclear bombs. Where do you find steel that is untarnished by nuclear bombs? The answer, Scapa Flow.
Wow.
So divers go into the water in Scapa Flow, do undersea cutting of pieces of those warships and bring it to the surface, and it is beautiful, perfect steel which has a property of no radioactivity. And the Geiger counters of the Nanda Devi story were made of this steel.
This is just marvelous. And I'm just thinking that in a perverse way, the ships were more useful under the water than they would have been over the water.
I mean, I'm sure the universe would have found some source,
Yeah.
but it is just so sweet that these stories tie together.
What an amazing story.
Yes, Amit, tell us your next story.
My next story is again fiction, But it's fiction, but it can be a low budget film which we could all get together and make if we wanted to. And this idea came to me when I was, going watching a lot of vlogs. There are all these random vlogs that I will see. Before I proceed, I want you to say vlogging. Say it.
Vlogging.
Vlog.
Vlogging.
Well done. I'm proud of you. Many people can't do this. So
Okay.
already, achievement unlocked, as it were. We have ticked the box.
Up to the next level.
Ajay can say vlogging. Now we go to the next level. So my story stars bloggers. Now these are the typical kind of personal blogs where you just kind of put a camera there and you're talking about stuff, or you take the camera with you and it follows you around and you talk to people and the camera is taking everything. So it is seemingly real life, but obviously there's a camera and people know there's a camera and etc. etc. And even though whatever happens is banal, you could really get hooked onto it. You really start feeling for the characters. You're interested. There is that sense of comfort, which I would hope some gentle readers feel when they watch us talking to each other as well, that they are who they are and I like these guys and I like hanging out with them. I watch a lot of stuff for those kinds of reasons. So these are those kind of naturalistic vloggers. Nothing is constructed. Put the camera or the phone on the table, you turn it towards yourself, and then you release it once a day, twice a day, whatever, right? And early in our film, there's a vloggers meetup, right? Now, all these people meet up, and there is an interesting overarching question here, that is a vlogger being real? Like, who am I really? We had an earlier episode where we spoke about how character is contingent. We spoke about how can we ever know ourselves, right? And that's a great question. Are we sometimes strangers to ourselves? Are we lying to ourselves? And to me, vlogging seems really interesting, because the only way a vlogger can succeed is when they're authentic to themselves and the audience can immediately sense that this person is being true to himself, he's who he is. But we may be true to ourselves, but we may not know ourselves. We may be lying to ourselves either. So there is that strange kind of dichotomy that there is a public face and there is a private face, and you are pretending they are the same, and you may not know any of them. So anyway, so at one point there is vloggers meet, as it were, and a bunch of vloggers meet. Now, you know what a Mexican standoff is?
I have a gun to your head, you have a gun to her head, she has a gun to my head.
Exactly, right. And there are many scenes like that, Reservoir Dogs and various scenes where you have different people having a gun to each other's head. Well, this is a vlogging Mexican standoff, right?
Where cameras on each other.
So where I shoot myself and you are in my background, you are shooting yourself, another person is shooting themselves. And first it's a three-way thing where each vlogger sing, and you cut from different vlogger narratives to others. And each vlogger sing has two other vloggers in the background. And then you keep pulling back, and there's a multiplicity, and it's like a hall of mirrors with people vlogging all around, and everybody else who is vlogging is in their scene. So it's just a beautiful, spectacular scene to satisfy the Tarantino in me, but nowhere near the crux of the story. The crux of the story always has to do with love, because human beings are frail and weak, and we need to look at that frailty, and love is a great way to bring it out. So there is one vlogger here who is like a perfectly everyday kind of Joe, very likable, seems like a nice guy, and one day he sees a new vlog has sprung up, and this new vlog is of someone who's completely different from all of them and appears completely constructed. And this is a person who appears at first to be a really beautiful woman, but androgynous. You can't really know for sure what this person is, but he falls in love with this person, and the realization kind of shocks him in two different ways. There is this great quote by Iris Murdoch: love is the extremely difficult realization that someone other than oneself is real. Right? We are all in the main character syndrome. We are all living this virtual reality in our heads where we are the main character, everyone else is a prop. But then when you fall in love, somebody else is real, and you realize that, and you have to account for that realness. So that shock of love is sort of one aspect of it, especially when you're living in this kind of interesting manufactured world, as it were. And the other aspect of this love is that he's not sure whether this person is really a woman. And the big question here is that if I have fallen in love with someone, is my love conditional on the nature of the genitals? You know, is that what love is conditional on? Or, if you think someone is a woman and you find they aren't, what do you do? Right? So it's a question. It's not a question that actually ever comes close to getting answered, but it's a question. And I would manipulate the story around in such a way where he falls in love and he tries to meet her and all that, that at the end of it, I want the viewer to realize that actually this person, male or female, that's a person who's being true to themselves. And all the other people are fake assholes. Not assholes in a pejorative sense, but they're all fake. We're all living out this play. We're all living out this drama. And this is one person who was being true to themselves. And that everyday kid Joe, not in some dramatic way where he turns out to be a serial killer or something, but just in a way where in gentle ways you're being dishonest to yourself, etc., etc. You are sort of not who you thought you were. So for me, and as far as the events that take us to that. My official line for that is, I'm not giving any spoilers here. You got to watch the film when it comes out. But actually, the truth is, I haven't thought of that yet. But that is a dramatic arc that I would like the story to go through, and that is kind of my story. It's a, there have been found footage films in the past, but as far as I know, this collision of vloggers and using found footage through vlogs alone and no third person shooting it, I'm not sure if it's ever been done, and this would be like really interesting to write and shoot and can be done on a really low budget.
Can I just draw you out on around the term authenticity? Okay, so you've often said, and I also get the intuition that in the internet age, you can't put on a contrived pose because A, the reader will see it, and B, you'll get bored playing it. Okay, like each of us are lazy beyond a point. So there is only one person that I can be without effort, and that is me. So if I try to play anything else, it would be an effort, and I can do it for a little bit, but I can't do it for a lot. Yeah, and I know you've often said that, and I get that line of attack. And for example, just now you said that the vloggers are authentic to something, and maybe they are in the process of discovering who they really are. And that's a fair angle. So I'm just curiously thinking that there's supposed to be this whole age of influencers on the internet. Are they authentic, or are they just acting in advertisements? Are they real, or is it all fake?
It's a good question, and honestly, while I have the view that you stated, I do, that we have to be authentic, and if you're not authentic, it won't work. At the same time, I question the word authenticity itself. Like, I think character is so contingent. If I don't have breakfast today, I could behave in a different way by evening because I'm so hungry. The chemical balance of my brain shifts. I could behave in a different way. We had a whole episode in this. So, are we who we think we are? What is there behind that? Like I often, and this is a unrelated context, but when I think of love and when I think of lust, in popular culture, there will be this sanskari notion that love is noble and lust is something base and we must like not talk about it. I actually prefer lust to love because lust is honest. That is authentic. You feel what you feel and you give into it, and it is what it is, and that is authentic. And love in many ways could be like an evolutionary adaptation. It can be a cover for so many things. I'm not denying that there is true love and there can be many different forms of it, but there is also the danger that so many things that we think to ourselves as love is actually a cover for something else, that our reptile brain wants something else, and it may not even be something reptilian. It's not that we want sex and we pretend to fall in love. Maybe we just want social acceptance of companionship with a particular kind of person because that will help our status, and then therefore we pretend to fall in love with someone, or etc etc. And it is a fact that science is kind of now established, and we'll link to books on that as well, that most of what we do, we don't do it for the reasons we think we do it for. We are doing post facto rationalization, right? And I'll link to columns I've written on this as well. So I don't even know what is authenticity. I think, we think of ourselves like, we think my character is a rock. No, it isn't. My character is a river. It's flowing into different places, it's flowing into different shapes. There are things
So shall
falling
we
into it.
shall we do a definition of authenticity as the laziest pose? It's a pose you take on which is the least effort.
That's a very good thought, and I'll take time to process it. And that's a good definition. Yeah, and it is perhaps the laziest pose, or it is a convenient pose which you then work at, but then you own it. Like the mask becomes a face often. So it depends on what is the mask over there, so yeah, I mean, it's something to think about. And you, authentically, Ajay Shah, are a thinker. So Ajay, last story of the day. Let's go for it. Give it to me.
The sun is going down, and actually I don't have a full story, but I have a great scene. Okay, like the writers of the world should wrap this into a full human interest story, but the scene is out of the world. Okay, I'll take you back to 1935. Mussolini had delusions of grandeur. He thought he would recreate the Roman Empire. Okay, and at the time the Italian economy and the Italian state was not remotely up to the capability of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. But Mussolini wanted to be military prowess and create an empire and so on, and he led an invasion of what is now Ethiopia and Somalia. Okay, and so like these poor, helpless Italian soldiers.
I thought you were going to say kittens.
Yeah, these poor, helpless Italian soldiers who were the most unmartial and unwarlike people that you could find. These were just guys who wanted to have a good time. Okay, were suddenly walking in burning hot valleys in the deserts of Ethiopia with trying to kill somebody for no particular reason, and their heart was not in the fight, and more importantly, their stomach was not in the fight. Okay, meaning, Mamma Mia, they started saying, I can't handle this military food. Okay, so there were groups of soldiers who were really out in the boondocks, who were rebelling on account of the bad food, saying like, look, I'll go out to faraway countries and I'll kill strangers, but you gotta feed me, okay? Like I need good Italian food, otherwise like there is no deal. So they devised a solution. And the solution was to strap parachutes on sheep and throw them out of planes. So sheep were picked up in Italy and put onto planes, and the plane would circle where the Italian army camps were, and one by one each sheep would be strapped to a parachute and thrown out, and it would land on a parachute down on the ground, and that's how a near mutiny by Italian soldiers was staved off. So I admit it's not a full story, but this is a hilarious scene.
This is the greatest scene of all time. Why live sheep? Why not just parachute meat down, boxes full of meat? Or...
It's complicated, no? The sheep is a life support system. It has an immune system.
Yeah.
It keeps the meat fresh.
Yeah. And also it can keep the soldiers company in other ways.
So you have to think 1935, refrigeration, all that was much more limited. So this was the strategy taken.
This is like the greatest thing. And are there any photographs
Yes,
of this?
there is one photograph. Yeah, of a sheep coming down. A very blurry, bad black and white photo, but yes, there is at least one photograph of this.
Gentle reader, you right there, you're still there. We are not wasting your time like he alleged at the start of the episode. We're not going to do any recommendations today because we have recommended these great stories. Go out there, read good non-fiction, read good fiction, read good books even if you don't know whether they are fiction or non-fiction, because after all, at the end of the day, everything, my friends, is stories. Everything, my friends, is everything.